Welcome to Heredity, Lesson 4 in Unit 2. We're starting on page 122. Our essential question is, how are traits inherited? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze the inheritance of traits in individuals. This is Khaleesi, my Pomeranian. When I bought her, the breeder said a lot of selective breeding went into creating her color, which is called lavender and is rather rare in palms. In this lesson, we're going to be learning that some traits are inherited from parents, such as coloring, and some traits are not. We will be looking at some genetic principles governing how traits are inherited. Members of the same family share certain traits. Can you think of some traits that family members share? Be sure and engage your brain before learning with predicting, describing, looking at active reading, and let's look at these vocabulary terms together. This list contains key themes that you'll learn in this lesson. As we read together, you want to make sure that you understand each definition. Heredity, gene, allele, genotype, phenotype, dominant, recessive, incomplete dominance, and codominance. Let's quickly classify traits. Organisms obtain traits from parents, and this is called inherited traits. Organisms learn and interact with the environment, and these are called acquired traits. What's heredity? Let's take Khaleesi for an example. Here's Khaleesi with her baby daddy. What do you see that is similar? What's different? I think it's striking that they both have the white muzzle with the little white blaze up on their forehead. I noticed the difference in the color of their noses. Although her daddy's coloring is much darker, he had recessive lavender genes, and her mother was a lavender-colored Pomeranian. These traits are a result of information stored in the puppy's genetic material. The passing of genetic material from parents to offspring is called heredity. What did Gregor Mendel discover about heredity? The first major experiments investigating heredity were performed by a monk named Gregor Mendel. Mendel lived in Austria in the 1800s. Before Mendel became a monk, he attended a university and studied science and mathematics. This training served him well when he began to study the inheritance of traits among pea plants in the monastery's garden. Mendel studied 7 different characteristics of pea plants: plant height, flower and pod position, seed shape, seed color, pod shape, pod color, and flower color. A characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. Mendel studied each pea plant characteristic separately, always starting with plants that were true breeding for that characteristic. A true breeding plant is one that will always produce offspring with a certain trait when allowed to self-pollinate. Each of the characteristics that Mendel studied had 2 different forms. For example, the color of a pea could be green or yellow. These different forms are called traits. So is the flower color a characteristic or a trait?
A flower color would be a characteristic.
Yes, thank you, Gregor. Then what would a pink flower be? A characteristic or a trait? Because pink is a different form of the characteristic. It would be called a trait.
Traits depend upon inherited factors.
Yes, thank you. In his experiment with seed pod color, Mendel took two sets of plants, one true breeding for plants that produce yellow seed pods, and the other true breeding for plants that produce green seed pods. Instead of letting the plants self-pollinate as they do naturally, he paired one plant from each set. He did this by fertilizing one plant with the pollen of another plant. Mendel called the plants that resulted from this cross
the first generation.
All of the plants from this first generation produced green seed pods. Mendel called this trait
the dominant trait.
Because the yellow trait seemed to recede or fade away, he called it
the recessive trait.
Then Mendel let the first generation plants self-pollinate. He called the offspring that resulted from self-pollination
the second generation.
About 3/4 of the second generation plants had green seed pods, but about 1/4 had yellow pods. So the trait that seemed to disappear in the first generation reappeared in the second generation. Mendel hypothesized
that each plant must have two heritable factors for each trait, one from each parent.
Some traits, such as yellow seed pod color, could only be observed if a plant received two factors, one from each parent. For yellow pod color, a plant with one yellow factor and one green factor would produce green pods because producing green pods is a dominant trait. However, this plant could still pass on the yellow factor to the next generation of plants, just as Khaleesi's father had a recessive gene, lavender color, as did Khaleesi's mother. Okay, kiddos, look at visualize it. In your own words, describe what has occurred. What trait is dominant? How do you know? What trait is recessive? How do you know? If you have a green seed and a yellow seed, what will the seeds produced by the next two generations of plants look like if two true breeding homozygous plants are crossed? Thank you for joining us, Gregor Mendel, and thank you for your contribution to science and understanding inheritance.
In my life, I had interest in both the supernatural and the natural seeds of life.